Lieutenant Sarah had always believed that coffee was the fuel that kept the Navy running. Every morning at 5:45 hours, she would arrive at the briefing room 15 minutes early, not because regulations required it, but because those quiet moments before the storm of daily operations gave her the clarity she needed. The coffee maker in the corner had become her faithful companion, gurgling to life as she prepared the first pot of what would become many throughout the day. The briefing room aboard the USS Constellation was nothing spectacular to look at. Gray walls lined with monitors, a large table that had seen countless strategic discussions, and fluorescent lights that hummed with the persistence of machinery that never truly rested. But for Sarah, this room represented everything she had worked toward since graduating from the Naval Academy 3 years ago. It was here that real decisions were made, where the theoretical knowledge from textbooks transformed into actionable intelligence that could save lives or change the course of operations. Her colleagues often joked that Sarah treated coffee preparation like a sacred ritual. She would measure the grounds with precision, ensure the water temperature was optimal, and time the brewing process to coincide perfectly with the arrival of senior officers. It was not obsessive behavior, but rather the attention to detail that had earned her recognition as one of the most promising young intelligence officers in her class. Every small task, she believed, deserved the same level of commitment and excellence that she applied to analyzing enemy movements or decoding intercepted communications. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Sarah arrived at her usual time, powered up the coffee maker, and began reviewing the intelligence reports that had come in overnight. The Mediterranean deployment had been relatively quiet for the past 2 weeks, but recent satellite imagery suggested increased activity around several strategic ports. Nothing alarming enough to change their current course, but significant enough to warrant discussion during the morning briefing. As the coffee finished brewing, Sarah arranged the cups on the side table with military precision. Admiral was known for her punctuality, and the rest of the senior staff would follow within minutes of her arrival. The Admiral had a reputation throughout the fleet as someone who commanded respect not through intimidation, but through her remarkable ability to see patterns others missed and make decisions that consistently proved correct under pressure. Sarah had served under Admiral for 8 months, but their interactions had been limited to formal briefings and the occasional acknowledgement in the corridors. The Admiral was professional, thorough, and maintained the kind of command presence that made junior officers want to exceed expectations. Sarah respected her immensely, though she sometimes wondered if the Admiral even knew her name beyond what appeared on duty rosters and report signatures. The familiar sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of the senior staff. Sarah quickly finished her preparations and took her position at the junior officers section of the table. Commander Williams, the operations officer, entered first, followed by Lieutenant Commander from Communications, and finally Admiral herself. The Admiral's presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room, not because she demanded attention, but because she naturally commanded it. As the briefing began, Sarah focused intently on the intelligence summary she would be presenting. The overnight reports contained some interesting developments in shipping patterns that might indicate supply line changes for potential hostile forces in the region. She had spent extra time cross-referencing the data with previous week's observations, and she was confident in her analysis. Discussion proceeded through standard operational updates, weather reports, and logistical considerations. Sarah waited for her turn to present the intelligence summary, mentally rehearsing her key points while simultaneously paying attention to the ongoing conversation about fuel consumption rates and maintenance schedules. The dual focus was second nature by now, a skill developed through months of briefings where every piece of information could potentially connect to something else in unexpected ways. When Admiral called for the intelligence update, Sarah stood and moved to the presentation screen. She began her summary with the confidence that came from thorough preparation, outlining the shipping pattern anomalies and their potential implications for regional security. The Admiral listened intently, occasionally nodding or making brief notes, but otherwise maintaining the focused silence that indicated serious consideration of the information being presented. Midway through her presentation, Sarah realized she was developing a slight tremor in her hands. It was not nervousness about public speaking, which had never been a problem for her, but rather an increasing awareness that something felt different about this morning. The Admiral's attention seemed more intense than usual, and there was an undercurrent of tension in the room that Sarah could not quite identify. She pushed through the remainder of her presentation, concluding with her assessment that continued monitoring was recommended, but no immediate action was necessary based on current intelligence. The Admiral thanked her for the thorough analysis and asked a few specific questions about data sources and confidence levels, questions that demonstrated she had been paying careful attention to every detail Sarah had presented. As Sarah returned to her seat, she noticed that Admiral was reviewing a folder that had not been on the table when the briefing began. Someone must have delivered it during the presentation, though Sarah had been too focused to notice the interruption. The Admiral's expression as she reviewed the contents was unreadable, maintaining the professional composure that made her such an effective leader, but Sarah sensed that whatever was in that folder was significant. The briefing continued with reports from other departments, but Sarah found her attention drifting to the Admiral's occasional glances at the mysterious folder. Years of intelligence training had taught her to notice when information was being processed differently than usual, and something about Admiral's demeanor suggested that the morning's routine was about to change dramatically. As the formal portions of the briefing concluded, Sarah began gathering her materials, already mentally transitioning to her next task of updating the intelligence database with the morning's observations. The coffee she had prepared so carefully earlier remained largely untouched by everyone except Commander Williams, who seemed to view caffeine as a basic food group necessary for proper brain function during early morning meetings. It was at this moment, as Sarah reached for the coffee pot to offer refills before everyone dispersed, that Admiral opened the folder with deliberate care and cleared her throat in a way that immediately commanded absolute attention from everyone in the room. The silence that followed Admiral's throat clearing was absolute. Even the usual background hum of the ship's systems seemed to fade as every person in the briefing room focused their complete attention on their commanding officer. Sarah had been in the process of lifting the coffee pot when she froze, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be significant beyond the scope of their routine morning meeting. Admiral's eyes swept across the room, making brief contact with each officer present before settling on the folder in front of her. The document inside appeared to be official correspondence, bearing the unmistakable letterhead and formatting that indicated it had originated from high levels within the Navy's command structure. Sarah could not read the specific content from her position, but the Admiral's careful handling of the material suggested it contained information that would impact their current operations. "Ladies and," Admiral began, her voice carrying the measured tone that officers throughout the fleet had learned to associate with important announcements, "I have received communication from Pacific Fleet Command that requires immediate attention and acknowledgement." The mention of Pacific Fleet Command sent a subtle ripple of increased attention through the room. Communications from that level typically involved significant operational changes, special assignments, or recognition for exceptional performance. Sarah continued holding the coffee pot, but her mind was now completely focused on what the Admiral was about to reveal. Admiral lifted the document from the folder and reviewed it once more before continuing. "This communication concerns a recommendation for commendation that was submitted through proper channels following our recent intelligence operations in the Eastern Mediterranean sector." She paused, allowing the significance of her words to register with the assembled officers. Sarah felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with professional interest. Commendations for intelligence work were relatively rare, partly because much of their success was measured by what did not happen rather than dramatic visible achievements. Preventing conflicts through accurate analysis and timely reporting rarely generated the kind of recognition that came from more visible forms of military excellence. The recommendation specifically cites analytical work that identified and tracked suspicious shipping movements 3 weeks ago, Admiral continued, her eyes now scanning the room as if searching for someone specific. This analysis led to the successful interdiction of materials that could have been used to threaten civilian shipping in international waters. Sarah's memory immediately jumped to a report she had compiled 3 weeks earlier. She had noticed unusual patterns in commercial shipping that did not align with normal trade routes or seasonal variations. The analysis had taken her several days of cross-referencing manifests, tracking vessel movements, and correlating the information with intelligence from other sources. She had been particularly proud of that work because it had required exactly the kind of detailed pattern recognition that she hoped would define her career in naval intelligence. At the time, she had submitted the report through normal channels and received acknowledgement that it had been forwarded to appropriate operational units. She had assumed, as was typical with intelligence work, that her analysis had become part of a larger information picture used by people far above her pay grade to make decisions she would never hear about. The possibility that her work had contributed to a successful operation had never occurred to her. Admiral was still speaking, but Sarah found herself struggling to process the words while simultaneously trying to recall every detail of the report she had submitted. Had she missed something significant? Was there some aspect of her analysis that had proven more valuable than she had realized? The uncertainty was almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to remain focused on what the Admiral was saying. The officer responsible for this analysis demonstrated exactly the kind of thorough, detailed thinking that exemplifies the best traditions of naval intelligence, Admiral continued. The work in question required not only technical competence, but also the intellectual curiosity to pursue connections that less experienced analysts might have overlooked. Sarah noticed that Commander Williams was glancing in her direction, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had been her immediate supervisor when she had submitted that particular report, and he had complimented her thoroughness at the time. Now she began to suspect that her work might be connected to whatever commendation Admiral was discussing. The Admiral returned her attention to the document, reading directly from the official language. Lieutenant Sarah is hereby recommended for the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal in recognition of superior analytical performance that directly contributed to the successful completion of Operation Vigilant Guardian. The sound of her own name spoken by Admiral hit Sarah like a physical force. The coffee pot in her hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, and she had to concentrate to keep from dropping it as the reality of what she had just heard began to register. Her analytical work had not only been noticed at higher levels, but had apparently played a role in an operation important enough to have an official designation. Operation Vigilant Guardian was not a name she recognized, which was not surprising given the compartmentalized nature of military operations. Intelligence analysts often contributed pieces to puzzles they never got to see completed. But hearing that her work had been integral to something significant enough to warrant a formal operation name was both thrilling and slightly overwhelming. The other officers in the room had turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from approval to genuine surprise. Lieutenant Commander was nodding with obvious appreciation, while Commander Williams looked like someone who had just vindicated his faith in their potential. The attention was both gratifying and uncomfortable, as Sarah had always preferred to let her work speak for itself rather than seeking recognition. Admiral was not finished reading from the commendation. Lieutenant's analysis identified supply chain anomalies that enabled operational forces to intercept and neutralize materials intended for use in attacks against civilian maritime traffic. Her work exemplifies the critical role of intelligence analysis in preventing threats before they can materialize into actual harm. Sarah realized that she was still holding the coffee pot and that everyone was looking at her expectantly. She carefully placed the pot back on its heating element and stood at attention, though no one had specifically instructed her to do so. The formal recognition was happening in the middle of their routine briefing room, surrounded by the familiar equipment and furniture that had become part of her daily routine, which somehow made the moment feel both surreal and perfectly appropriate. Admiral set the document aside and looked directly at Sarah for the first time since reading the commendation. Lieutenant, this recognition reflects not only your individual achievement, but also the high standards that we strive to maintain throughout this command. Your work on this analysis demonstrates exactly the kind of thorough, thoughtful approach that makes the difference between routine intelligence reporting and actionable intelligence that saves lives. The Admiral paused, and Sarah sensed that there was more to come. The formal reading of the commendation seemed to be only part of what Admiral intended to communicate. The intensity of the Admiral's attention suggested that this moment was about more than just acknowledging past success. Admiral maintained eye contact with Sarah for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. The briefing room had become so quiet that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. She remained at attention, waiting for whatever would come next, but completely unprepared for the direction the conversation was about to take. Lieutenant, Admiral said, her voice shifting to a tone that somehow managed to be both formal and personal. There is additional information contained in this communication that requires your immediate attention. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The commendation had already exceeded anything she had expected from her morning routine, but the Admiral's demeanor suggested that more significant revelations were coming. The other officers in the room seemed to sense this as well, maintaining their respectful silence while clearly understanding that they were witnessing something unusual. Admiral reached into the folder and a second document, this one bearing different letterhead that Sarah could not read from her position. The Admiral reviewed this document briefly before returning her attention to Sarah with an expression that seemed to combine professional satisfaction with something that might have been personal pride. 3 months ago, Admiral began, you submitted a request through your commanding officer to be considered for advanced intelligence training at the Naval Postgraduate School. Your application included recommendations from your instructors, performance evaluations, and a personal statement outlining your career objectives in naval intelligence. Sarah remembered the application process clearly. It had represented her hope to specialize in strategic intelligence analysis, working with the kind of complex, long-term patterns that required advanced mathematical modeling and sophisticated analytical techniques. The program was highly competitive, accepting only a handful of officers each year, and Sarah had submitted her application knowing that the chances of acceptance were small, but believing that the effort was worthwhile regardless of the outcome. Your application has been under review by a selection committee composed of senior intelligence officers from across the fleet, Admiral continued. The committee evaluates candidates based on demonstrated analytical ability, academic performance, leadership potential, and recommendations from commanding officers. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized that Admiral was about to tell her whether her application had been successful. The timing, coming immediately after the commendation, seemed too coincidental to be random. Had her recent analytical work influenced the selection committee's decision? Or was Admiral simply taking advantage of an appropriate moment to deliver news that would have come anyway? Lieutenant, Admiral said, pausing briefly to ensure she had Sarah's complete attention. Your application has been approved. You have been selected for advanced intelligence training beginning with the next academic cycle. The news hit Sarah with stunning force. Acceptance into the advanced program represented everything she had hoped to achieve in her naval career. The training would provide access to analytical techniques and technologies that were available only to the most promising intelligence officers. More importantly, it would position her for assignments involving strategic-level analysis that could influence major operational decisions. But Admiral was not finished. She set the acceptance letter aside and picked up yet another document from the folder. There is one additional matter that requires discussion, she said, her tone becoming more serious. Your selection for advanced training comes with immediate reassignment to a classified program that I am authorized to brief you on, pending your acceptance of the assignment. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Classified assignments were common in intelligence work, but the way Admiral was presenting this information suggested something beyond routine classification levels. The mention of requiring her acceptance implied that she would have some choice in whether to proceed, which was unusual for most military assignments. The program in question involves long-term strategic analysis supporting operations that I cannot describe in detail without your commitment to proceed, Admiral continued. What I can tell you is that your recent analytical work has brought you to the attention of people who coordinate intelligence activities at the highest levels of naval operations. Sarah realized that everyone in the briefing room was watching this conversation with intense interest. Commander Williams looked as surprised as she felt, suggesting that even her immediate supervisor had not been briefed on whatever Admiral was discussing. The level of compartmentalization implied by the Admiral's careful language was unlike anything Sarah had encountered in her career. Lieutenant, Admiral said, her voice now carrying unmistakable authority, if you choose to accept this assignment, you will be read into programs that will fundamentally change your role within naval intelligence. The work will be challenging, often frustrating, and will require absolute discretion regarding information that affects national security at the strategic level. The weight of the decision being presented to Sarah was almost overwhelming. Everything she had worked toward in her naval career had led to this moment, but she was being asked to commit to something she did not fully understand. The trust implicit in Admiral's offer was both flattering and terrifying. Admiral reached for the final document in the folder. Before you respond, there is one more piece of information that I am required to share with you. She unfolded what appeared to be a message from Naval Communications, formatted in the style used for operational traffic between commands. Last night, Pacific Fleet Intelligence received a priority message requesting immediate contact with an analyst designated by the call sign, Oracle 7, Admiral said, watching Sarah's face carefully for her reaction. This call sign was assigned to your analytical work 3 weeks ago by operational commanders who needed a way to reference the source of intelligence they were acting upon. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Having a call sign assigned to her work meant that operational commanders had not only used her analysis, but had found it valuable enough to warrant ongoing reference and potential future requests for similar analysis. It meant that her work had crossed the boundary from routine intelligence reporting to actionable operational intelligence that was being used by people making real-time tactical decisions. Oracle 7, Admiral repeated, allowing the significance of the designation to settle in the room. The message requesting contact with Oracle 7 came directly from the commander of Joint Task Force Sentinel, currently operating in classified locations throughout the Mediterranean and surrounding regions. The silence in the briefing room became absolute. Sarah realized that she was no longer simply lieutenant, a promising young intelligence analyst serving aboard a Mediterranean deployment. She had somehow become Oracle 7, an analytical resource that operational commanders were actively seeking to consult for ongoing missions that she knew nothing about. Admiral folded the communications message and returned it to the folder. "Lieutenant," she said with unmistakable formality, "I am authorized to ask whether you accept assignment as the primary analytical support for Joint Task Force Sentinel, with immediate transfer to classified facilities for advanced briefing and integration into ongoing operations." Sarah stood there holding everything she had thought she understood about her career in her hands, watching it transform into something entirely different and far more significant than she had ever imagined possible. The coffee she had been pouring when this all began seemed to belong to a different person living a completely different life. The weight of Admiral's question hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah could feel the eyes of every officer in the room focused on her, but their attention felt distant compared to the intensity of her own thoughts racing through the implications of what she had just heard. Oracle 7, a call sign that connected her analytical work to operational commanders she had never met, making decisions about situations she could only guess at from intelligence fragments. Time seemed suspended as Sarah processed the magnitude of the choice being presented to her. Accepting the assignment would mean leaving behind everything familiar about her current role, stepping into responsibilities that would dwarf anything she had previously encountered. The advanced training at the Naval Postgraduate School, which had seemed like the pinnacle of her career aspirations just minutes earlier, now appeared to be merely the entry point into something far more complex and demanding. But there was another dimension to her decision that went beyond personal career considerations. The mention of Joint Task Force Sentinel and ongoing operations meant that real-world events were unfolding in real time, and operational commanders believed that her analytical capabilities could contribute meaningfully to those events. People were making tactical decisions based on intelligence analysis, and those decisions had consequences that extended far beyond academic exercises or training scenarios. Sarah thought about the shipping pattern analysis that had apparently earned her the Oracle 7 designation. At the time, she had approached it as a challenging analytical problem, enjoying the intellectual satisfaction of finding patterns in complex data. She had never imagined that her work would contribute to actual operational success, or that commanders in the field would find her analysis valuable enough to request her continued involvement in their missions. Admiral waited patiently, showing no sign of impatience despite the significance of the decision being requested. The Admiral's composed demeanor suggested that she understood the complexity of what she was asking and was prepared to allow Sarah the time necessary to consider all the implications. But Sarah also sensed that the opportunity being presented was time-sensitive, connected to operations that could not wait indefinitely for her decision. The practical considerations were substantial. Accepting the assignment would mean immediate transfer away from the USS Constellation and the colleagues who had become part of her daily routine. It would mean working with people she had never met, on projects she could not yet understand, under levels of classification that would limit her ability to discuss her work with anyone outside the program. The isolation inherent in high-level intelligence work was something she had read about but never experienced directly. But against these concerns, Sarah weighed the recognition implicit in being selected for such an assignment. Operational commanders did not request specific analysts unless they had compelling reasons to believe that those individuals could contribute capabilities not available elsewhere. The fact that her work had earned a call sign meant that people with responsibility for mission success had identified her as a valuable resource worth integrating into their ongoing operations. Sarah also considered the broader implications of her decision. Naval intelligence existed to support operational success and ultimately to protect national security interests. If her analytical skills could contribute meaningfully to those objectives, then accepting challenging assignments was not just a career opportunity, but a professional obligation. She had joined the Navy to serve something larger than her individual interests, and this assignment seemed to represent the fulfillment of that commitment in ways she had never anticipated. The technical challenges of the work also appealed to her intellectual curiosity. Working with Joint Task Force Sentinel would presumably involve access to intelligence sources and analytical tools that were not available in routine assignments. The opportunity to apply her skills to problems at the strategic level, working with data streams and analytical challenges that pushed the boundaries of her current capabilities, was exactly what she had hoped to achieve through advanced training. Admiral seemed to sense that Sarah was reaching a decision. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, "I want you to understand that accepting this assignment will be demanding in ways that routine intelligence work cannot prepare you for. You will be working with information that affects operations where the margin for error is essentially zero. The analytical standards will be higher than anything you have previously encountered, and the consequences of mistakes will extend far beyond academic evaluation." The Admiral's warning was clearly intended to ensure that Sarah understood the magnitude of what she was accepting, but it also reinforced her growing conviction that this opportunity represented exactly the kind of challenge she had been preparing for throughout her career. The possibility of making meaningful contributions to operations that mattered was worth the risks and difficulties involved. Sarah straightened to her full attention posture and looked directly at Admiral. "Admiral, I accept the assignment," she said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded despite the intensity of everything she was feeling. Admiral nodded with what appeared to be satisfaction mixed with approval. "Very good, Lieutenant, or should I say, Oracle 7. The slight smile that accompanied this comment suggested that the Admiral was pleased both with Sarah's decision and with her own role in facilitating this opportunity. The other officers in the room relaxed slightly, though Sarah could see that they were all processing the implications of what they had just witnessed. Commander Williams looked proud, but also slightly concerned, probably contemplating the loss of one of his most promising analysts. Lieutenant Commander was nodding with obvious appreciation for the recognition Sarah had received. Admiral gathered the documents from the folder and stood, indicating that the formal portion of the briefing was complete. "Lieutenant, you will receive detailed briefing materials and transfer orders within the next few hours. Your replacement aboard the Constellation will arrive before your departure, ensuring continuity of intelligence operations." Sarah realized that her transformation from routine intelligence analyst to Oracle 7 was already in motion, set into action by decisions made at levels far above the briefing room where she stood. The efficiency with which everything was being arranged suggested that her selection had been planned well in advance, possibly even before the commendation that had initiated this morning's revelations. As the other officers began gathering their materials and preparing to leave, Sarah remained standing next to the coffee station where this entire sequence of events had begun. The coffee pot still sat on its warming plate, the morning's brew now probably too strong to drink comfortably, but somehow still representing the routine normalcy that her life had possessed just 30 minutes earlier. Admiral approached her as the room emptied. "Lieutenant, I want you to know that your selection for this assignment reflects not only your demonstrated capabilities, but also the confidence that senior leadership has in your potential for continued growth. The work you will be doing as Oracle 7 will challenge you in ways that will define the rest of your career in naval intelligence." Sarah nodded, finally beginning to grasp the full significance of what had just occurred. "Thank you, Admiral. I understand the responsibility involved, and I'm ready to meet those challenges." Admiral extended her hand for a handshake that felt more personal than the usual formal military courtesies. I have no doubt that you will exceed expectations, just as you have done with every assignment since joining my command. The Navy is fortunate to have officers like you choosing intelligence as their specialty. As Admiral left the briefing room, Sarah stood alone among the empty coffee cups and scattered papers that remained from their morning meeting. Everything looked exactly the same as it had when she had arrived to prepare the coffee just over an hour ago, but she understood that she was no longer the same person who had performed that routine task. She had become Oracle 7, and her real career in naval intelligence was just beginning.